I was sitting at the head of the table when my sister stopped talking mid-sentence. Not paused, stopped, the way a record stops when someone lifts the needle off it. Renata had been telling a story about the caterer, the turkey dry 2 years running, her hand still raised, wine glass halfway to her mouth, when she looked up and saw where I was sitting. Not beside her, not across from her. At the head. Walter's seat. I'd like to tell you I felt something dramatic. Triumph, maybe. I didn't. I felt the tablecloth under my palms, heavy linen, the kind his mother bought in 1987 and never replaced, because in that family, some things were built to last. I felt the fork in my right hand. It was 7 minutes past 4. Renata's mouth was still open. 2 years before that, at her wedding, she'd looked at me across the aisle and said something I've never repeated to another person. Not my mother, not my lawyer, not even Walter, though by now I think he's guessed the shape of it. I'll tell you what she said, just not yet, because to understand why it didn't destroy me, you need to know who I was before she said it, and who I became after. 2 years earlier, I was still the sister nobody worried about. Before I go further, one thing to whoever's listening to this in the car, or the kitchen, or lying awake at 2 a.m., if you've ever watched someone try to win by humiliating you in front of a room full of people, and you didn't give them the reaction they wanted, you already know the shape of this story. I'm not going to raise my voice in this one. Neither did I, that day. That's really the whole point of it. Stay a while if that's the kind of story you're here for. Subscribe if you'd like. Tell me in the comments if you've lived some version of it yourself. Now let me take you back. My name is Claire. I was 34 when this started, and I'd spent 9 years reading documents for a living, trusts, wills, contracts, the fine print people sign without understanding what they've agreed to. It's not a glamorous job. No one has ever asked me to tell a dinner party about my most exciting closing. But it teaches you something most people never learn. The truth is almost always written down somewhere, plainly, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. I was patient. My mother used to joke that I came out of the womb reading the fine print on my own birth certificate. Renata was nothing like that. 2 years younger, and she had never once in her life stood quietly in a room. She sang before she could talk in full sentences. She cried at school assemblies, real tears, on command, and it never looked fake, because for Renata, performance wasn't a mask over the truth. It was just how she experienced things, loudly, publicly, with an audience in mind even when the audience was only family at Sunday dinner. I loved her. I want to say that plainly before anything else. I loved my sister the way you love someone who's always taken up more air in the room than you have. Not resentfully, just as a fact, the kind you'd note in a document. I tell you this because it matters later. The version of me who sat at Walter's table with steady hands on the linen was built years before Renata ever stood at an altar and looked at me the way she did. I had no idea yet what she was capable of saying out loud, just to see what it would do to my face. I was about to find out. Daniel and I had dated for 3 years. Nothing dramatic ended it. We wanted different things, and I was the one who said so out loud, which is its own kind of ending. That was March. By the following January, Renata was engaged to him. I found out from a group text. A photo of a ring I recognized, because I'd helped him pick it out for someone else 18 months earlier, in a jewelry store on 4th Street with lighting that was too bright, and a salesman who kept calling us you two, like we were already a unit. Renata never knew that detail. I never told her. Some things you keep instead of saying out loud. I went to the wedding. People asked me for months afterward why I'd do that to myself, and the answer is simple. Not going would have made it a story about me. Going made it a story about them. Absence gives people something to talk about. Presence gives them nothing to hold on to except good behavior. So I sat in the 4th row, in Navy, and watched my sister marry my ex-boyfriend in a barn upstate that cost, I learned later, close to $60,000 to rent and decorate for one evening. The ceremony was lovely, honestly. Renata has always known how to stage a moment. String lights, a quartet, her hair down the way she knows photographs best. 140 guests, and she used every one of them. Near the end, after the vows, before the kiss, she turned toward me instead of Daniel and smiled the way you smile at someone when you already know how the story ends, and they don't. And she said it. I'm not going to tell you what, not yet. I've thought about that choice for a long time, and I keep landing in the same place. You need to sit with not knowing, the way I sat with knowing for 2 years, before I say it out loud the way she said it to 140 guests and me. What I'll tell you instead is what I did, because it matters more. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I kept my hands folded in my lap and watched Daniel's jaw tighten the moment the words left her mouth, like a man watching a contract get signed without having read all the clauses. The officiant kept moving, smooth as anything, because a wedding doesn't stop for cruelty. It just absorbs it and calls it a toast later. My mother, 3 rows back, had gone very still. One more thing, though I didn't understand its weight until much later. An older man near the front, silver-haired, sitting alone on the groom's side, had also gone still. Also, quietly, hadn't clapped when everyone else did. I didn't know his name yet. Remember that detail. It matters more than almost anything else here. I drove home alone that night, still in the navy dress, and didn't cry then either. I put the day away carefully, completely, without editing it into something easier to carry. She wasn't the only one taking notes that day. I was too. I just never told anyone what mine said. I didn't disappear. That's the first thing people got wrong about me afterward. They expected me to fade quietly out of family gatherings, the way you'd expect a wound to want darkness. Instead, I showed up. Christmas. My mother's birthday. The 4th of July barbecue my aunt hosted every year with the same potato salad. On time, dressed well, and I never mentioned the wedding. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because I'd already put it somewhere. It couldn't be used against me. At work, I made partner 2 years ahead of schedule. Nothing dramatic about it, no announcement email with exclamation points. Just a Tuesday morning meeting where the managing partner slid a new title across the table and said he'd been meaning to do it for a while. I said thank you and went back to finish the trust review I'd been working on before lunch. That's the kind of rise I trust more than the loud kind. Earned. Nobody can later claim it was luck. Renata's life looked extraordinary from the outside. She and Daniel bought a house in a neighborhood neither salary could have covered alone. 4 bedrooms, a pool, the kind of curb appeal that gets photographed for anniversary posts. What people didn't see, because Renata never posted it, was where the down payment came from. I knew, because I still spoke to my mother, and my mother still spoke to Daniel's father. In that loose way, families stay connected through people who never officially divorce anyone. Daniel's father covered the down payment. He covered the second mortgage 3 years later, when Daniel's fitness studio folded within 18 months. Eventually, he covered the private school tuition for Renata's stepdaughter from Daniel's first marriage. A detail that rarely made it into the birthday party and beach vacation photos Renata posted every few weeks. I wasn't watching for any of this. I wasn't building a file on my sister's marriage the way I built files at work. I just have a professional habit of noticing what's said and what's paid for, and rarely confusing one with the other. It was at my mother's 70th birthday, 18 months after the wedding, that I met him properly for the first time. Daniel's father, Walter. I recognized him before anyone introduced us. Silver-haired, quiet, the man who hadn't clapped. He shook my hand and said, "You're the sister, the lawyer." Not unkindly, almost like a fact he'd been sitting on, waiting for the right moment to say. "Trust attorney," I said. "There's a difference. If you ever need someone to explain why your accountant is wrong about something." He almost smiled, First time in 2 years anyone in that family had looked at me like a person instead of a cautionary tale. "I might take you up on that," he said. I didn't think much of it at the time. Remember that I didn't. Walter called 3 weeks later, not just about the trust document he'd mentioned. He had a question, he said, about a clause in his own estate plan that his current attorney kept explaining in language that told him nothing. I met him for coffee, not dinner. That distinction mattered to me, and I think to him too. He wore a watch that had clearly cost something once, years ago, and had never been replaced, though he could have replaced it 100 times without noticing the money leave his account. He drove a truck. He ordered black coffee and never performed indifference to price, because he'd never had to. I remember thinking I'd never once seen Daniel order the cheapest thing on a menu, and never once seen Walter order anything else. We talked 90 minutes about trusts, then, without either of us steering it there, about his late wife, my work, and why I'd stayed patient instead of disappearing the way everyone expected. "You didn't flinch," he said near the end. "At the wedding, I watched the whole time, not once." "I filed it," I said. "Flinching doesn't do anything useful." He laughed. Short, real, the first I'd heard from him. His longtime advisor, a woman named Pat who'd managed his portfolio for 11 years, said something later I still think about. I ran into her at his office dropping off a document, and she studied me for a long moment before speaking. "He hasn't laughed like that in front of anyone since Marion died," she said. "Just so you know what you're looking at." I didn't know what to do with that at the time. I let it sit. What I didn't say to Pat, and I'll say to you now, is that I'd started looking forward to his calls more than I wanted to admit to myself. That part I'll let you imagine, because what happened next, I didn't tell anyone until it was already done. Walter and I married on a Tuesday morning in October at the county courthouse with 2 witnesses, Pat and my mother, who cried quietly and asked nothing I wasn't ready to answer. No quartet, no barn upstate, no 140 guests watching to see if I'd flinch. The ceremony took 11 minutes. I know because I checked my watch when the clerk said, "You may sign now," and again when we walked out. 11 minutes, for something that would take considerably longer to sort out on paper. Honestly, the paperwork took longer than the wedding did. Weeks longer. Walter had built something over 40 years that couldn't just be folded into a new marriage without care, and I insisted it be handled properly, by someone other than me. I'll tell you why that mattered later. For now, just know I was the one who slowed it down, not sped it up. We didn't announce it. We told the people who needed to know, in whatever order made sense, and let the rest of the family find out the way families always eventually find out everything. Sideways, through someone else, at the worst possible time for whoever didn't want to be first. Renata found out from the family group chat. My cousin posted a photo my mother had shared privately, not realizing it would travel. Walter and me on the courthouse steps, his hand on my shoulder, both laughing at something Pat had said off camera. 43 minutes later, by the read receipts, Renata left the chat without a word. She called our mother that night. I wasn't on the call, but my mother told me about it afterward, choosing her words carefully, the way she always did when protecting one daughter from the other. "She kept asking how long you'd known him," my mother said. Not if. How long? Hearing that, I understood Renata wasn't upset about the marriage yet. She was upset about the math. How long I might have been sitting quietly inside a room she thought she'd locked me out of 2 years earlier. She had no idea what that room actually contained. I want to pause here, because I think about this part often. Somewhere in that house, Renata was sitting with a fact she couldn't undo. The sister she'd humiliated at her own wedding was now, legally, her stepmother. Drop a 1 in the comments if you'd have stayed as calm in that seat. And if you've lived some version of this in your own family, tell me. I read everyone. Thanksgiving was 5 weeks away. Renata still didn't know I'd be sitting at the head of the table. Renata arrived 20 minutes early. I know because I was already in the kitchen when her car pulled into the drive, and I watched her sit there a full minute before getting out, composing herself the way you do before walking into a room you've already decided to control. She'd dressed carefully, cream-colored, tailored, chosen for photographs rather than comfort. I understood the strategy without anyone explaining it. Walk in, be gracious about an awkward new arrangement, leave everyone remembering how well she'd handled it. She'd done it before, 100 times. Handle the room, leave with the story. What she hadn't planned for was the place cards. Walter's housekeeper, Marisol, had set the table that morning under my direction. Renata's card sat where it always had, to the left, near her father-in-law. Mine sat at the head, not because I'd asked, but because Walter had quietly told Marisol to put it there at every family dinner for the past 2 months, without ever announcing it. Renata noticed. I watched her notice, her eyes moving from the empty chair at the head to me, standing near it with a serving spoon, entirely unbothered, like a chair I'd sat in 100 times before. Daniel noticed too, coming in a few steps behind her, his jaw doing the thing I remembered from the wedding, tightening slightly, a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. Walter came out of his study at exactly 4, greeted everyone warmly, kissed Renata on the cheek the way he always had, and said, lightly, almost as an afterthought, "Claire, why don't we get started, since you've got the toast?" I hadn't told anyone I had a toast, hadn't written one. But I understood exactly what Walter was doing, and why he'd asked me quietly 2 weeks earlier whether I'd be comfortable saying a few words, if it came up. It had come up. Renata sat down slowly, the cream-colored dress suddenly looking less like armor and more like something she'd chosen for a different day than the one she was about to have. I raised my glass. The room went quiet the way rooms do when they sense something is about to be settled, before anyone said anything at all. "I want to thank Walter," I said, "for a lot of things, but mostly for teaching me that some decisions are worth taking a long time to get right." I looked at Renata as I said it, just for a second. Her hand, still holding her glass, had gone very still. Walter waited until the plates were cleared before he said the rest. He didn't stand. He set down his coffee cup, folded his hands on the tablecloth, the same heavy linen his mother had bought decades earlier, and looked around the table the way he'd look at a contract before signing it. Unhurried, certain, already finished deciding. "There's something I should have said months ago," he said. "I kept putting it off because I didn't want it to feel like an announcement, but I think it's time you all knew." He nodded toward me. I didn't move. I'd known this was coming for 3 weeks, ever since the independent attorney Walter had hired, deliberately not me, because I'd insisted on that separation from the start, finished the amendment, and sent it over for signing. 6 weeks ago, Walter said, I updated my estate plan. Claire is now named co-trustee, alongside Pat, over the family trust. That includes the business accounts, the property holdings, and the disbursement schedule for tuition, mortgages, and any future loans. The word disbursement landed at the table like something dropped from a height. Renata's fork was still resting against her plate. She hadn't picked it back up since dessert. "Disbursement schedule," she repeated quietly, like she was translating it from a language she only half spoke. "The one that's been covering the house," Walter added gently, never cruelly about it. "I want that understood. And the tuition. And the studio loan, from 3 years ago." I watched Daniel's face the way I'd watched it 2 years earlier at the altar, and I saw the exact moment his composure left him. It wasn't dramatic, smaller than that. His hand near his water glass went still, the way a man's hand goes still when he understands, all at once, whose signature will now sit beneath every check that keeps his life running. "Nothing changes day to day," Walter said. "But going forward, any distribution above the standard allowance, The mortgage refinance you asked about last month, Renata, the school deposit for next year, goes through Claire and Pat. Together. That's how it works. Renata's eyes came to me. I'd been waiting for that. You knew, she said. Not a question. This whole time, you knew, and you sat there. 3 weeks, I said. My voice didn't rise, not once, through any of this. I asked Walter to use an outside attorney to draft it, so no one could ever say I'd written myself into anything. I wanted it entirely his decision, made without me in the room. She stared at me for a long moment. I let her. Silence does more work than any sentence I could build to fill it. 2 years ago, I said finally, quietly, you told me I'd never find anyone now. The table went very still. My mother's hand tightened around her napkin. I found someone, I said. I just didn't need an audience to know it. Renata said nothing. Her face did what a face does when someone is recalculating, in real time, everything they believed true about the last 2 years of their life. The house, the tuition, the quiet assumption that her father-in-law's money would always simply be there, unquestioned, like weather. It wasn't unquestioned anymore. It had my name on it too. Renata didn't yell. I want to be clear, because people expect this part loud, and it wasn't. She set her fork down fully, the way you set something down when you no longer trust your hand to hold it steady, and stared at the tablecloth instead of at any of us. I don't understand, she said quietly. I don't understand how this happened. It happened slowly, I said, the way most real things do. Daniel reached for her hand under the table. She didn't take it. I noticed and filed it without comment because it wasn't mine to comment on. My mother started to say something, some smoothing, peacekeeping thing she'd said 100 times at family dinners, and Walter reached over and touched her wrist. A small signal that this moment didn't need rescuing. Renata looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't really cry. I think 2 years of performing had taught her, the way 9 years of fine print had taught me, that some moments are too important to perform through. Are you going to make this hard for us? She asked. The house, Daniel's loan. Are you going to use this to… No, I said. She blinked. I'm not going to make anything harder than it already is, I said. Pat and I will run the trust the way it's always run, fairly, on schedule, based on what's actually needed. Your stepdaughter's tuition goes through in January like always. Nothing changes for you financially. I want that clear. I let that sit before I said the rest. What I want you to understand, I said, is that I'm not doing this to hurt you. I never was. I didn't marry Walter to get here. I married him because 2 years ago, at your wedding, a quiet man in the 4th row didn't clap when you humiliated me, and I noticed that before I noticed anything else about him. What was left of Renata's composure folded in completely, not loudly, just a long breath, her eyes closing a second too long, her hand finally reaching for Daniel's under the table. I'm sorry, she said, barely audible. For what I said. At the wedding. I know, I said. You don't have to say it out loud. I already put it away a long time ago. The table was quiet after that. Not tense, just quiet. The way a room goes quiet after something true has finally been said in it. That was 8 months ago now. Renata and I don't talk often, but we talk. She came to Easter dinner in the spring and sat 2 seats down from the head of the table, not because anyone assigned her there, but because it no longer occurred to either of us that the seating mattered the way it once had. Daniel's studio, the second one, opened in June. Modest this time, self-funded, no loan attached. Pride or a lesson learned? Probably both. Walter still drinks his coffee black and drives the same truck. Pat and I meet every quarter to review the trust, and there's nothing dramatic in those meetings either, just numbers, schedules, decisions made carefully and on time. I've come to like that rhythm. I think I always did, even before I understood why. I sit at the head of the table now without thinking about it. Somewhere around the fourth or fifth dinner, it stopped being a statement. It just became where I sit. If you've ever had a moment like this, where staying calm did more damage than losing your temper ever could, tell me in the comments. I read all of them, even the long ones, especially the long ones. 2 years ago, at an altar, my sister looked at me and said I'd never find anyone now. She was right, in a way she didn't intend. I never did find anyone the way she meant it. I found a family instead. And a seat at its head. That's the part she never accounted for.